The night was supposed to be perfect. February 17th, 1974. A Sunday evening in Fort Worth, Texas, where the winter air carried that peculiar Texas chill. Not quite cold enough to keep young love indoors, but cool enough to make you want to hold someone close. Carla Walker was 17 years old, and she had no idea that in less than an hour, her entire world would be ripped apart by a monster wearing a human face. I want you to stop scrolling for just a moment. I want you to really hear me. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just another true crime story. This is the story of a girl whose voice was stolen for 46 years. This is the story of a family who refused to let her become just another cold case statistic. And this is the story of how one phone call in 2020 finally brought a killer to justice. A phone call that came decades after everyone said it was impossible. If you've ever wondered whether evil can truly hide forever, whether justice can reach across nearly half a century to grab someone by the throat, stay with me. Because the answer is going to shake you to your core. And I need to ask you something before we go any further. If you believe that victims deserve to have their stories told, if you believe that families deserve answers no matter how long it takes, then share this video right now. Subscribe to this channel. Because Carla Walker's story almost disappeared into the void of forgotten cases. And the only reason it didn't is because people refused to let her be forgotten. Don't let her be forgotten again. Don't scroll past her face like so many others did for 46 years. Now let me take you back to that February night in 1974. Carla Walker was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter. She was a senior at Western Hills High School, a member of the drill team, the kind of girl who lit up every room she walked into with her warm smile and infectious laugh. She had long brown hair that she wore parted in the middle, the style of that era, and eyes that sparkled with the kind of optimism that only 17-year-olds still possess. She was in love. His name was Rodney McCoy, her boyfriend, and that Valentine's Day weekend had been filled with the kind of innocent romance that defined young love in the 1970s. They had attended a Valentine's dance together, and on this particular Sunday night, they decided to extend their celebration just a little longer. Fort Worth in 1974 was a city caught between two worlds. It still carried the rugged spirit of its cattle-driving past, but it was rapidly modernizing, spreading outward into new suburbs and shopping centers. The bowling alley where Carla and Rodney had spent part of their evening was one of those modern gathering spots, a place where teenagers could be teenagers, where the biggest worry was supposed to be whether you'd get home before curfew. They left the bowling alley sometime around 9:30 that night. Rodney drove them to a quiet parking lot near the Ridgely Country Club, a secluded spot where young couples often went to talk, to steal kisses, to dream about their futures together. It was innocent. It was normal. It was exactly what millions of teenagers across America were doing on that same Sunday night. But someone was watching. The parking lot was dark, lit only by distant streetlights and the soft glow of the dashboard. Carla and Rodney talked about their plans, about graduation, about all the possibilities that stretched out before them like an endless highway. They had no way of knowing that those possibilities were about to be stolen. The attack came without warning. A man appeared at the driver's side window. Before Rodney could react, he was struck in the head multiple times. Brutal, vicious blows that rendered him unconscious. The violence was so sudden, so savage, that Rodney never had a chance to fight back, never had a chance to protect the girl he loved. When Rodney regained consciousness, he was alone. Carla was gone. The car was still there. The keys were still in the ignition. But the seat where Carla had been sitting just moments before was empty, as if she had simply vanished into the cold February night. Rodney was disoriented, bleeding, struggling to understand what had just happened. His head throbbed with pain, and the world seemed to spin around him as he tried to piece together the fragments of his shattered memory. He remembered headlights. He remembered a figure. He remembered the sickening sound of impact. And then nothing. He called for Carla. His voice echoed across the empty parking lot, swallowed by the darkness. There was no response. Just the distant sound of traffic and the pounding of his own terrified heart. The police were called. Within hours, Fort Worth was mobilized in a desperate search for the missing teenager. Carla's parents, Don and Fran Walker, were notified. A knock on the door that no parent should ever have to answer, bearing news that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The investigation began immediately, but the evidence was scarce. Rodney could provide only fragments of description. A man, possibly in his 20s, but the darkness and the violence had obscured any details that might lead to identification. There were no witnesses who had seen the abduction. No one had heard Carla scream. It was as if she had been swallowed by the night itself. The search lasted 3 days. 3 agonizing days where hope slowly curdled into dread, where every passing hour made the worst-case scenario more likely. Volunteers scoured the area around the country club. Police followed up on every tip, no matter how small. The community prayed. On February 20th, 1974, those prayers went unanswered. Carla's body was found in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, about 8 miles from where she had been taken. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The medical examiner determined that she had been alive for at least 2 days after her abduction, 2 days of unimaginable terror before her killer finally silenced her forever. But here's what you need to understand, and this is important. Carla Walker did not go quietly. The evidence suggested that she had fought her attacker. She had struggled. She had resisted with everything she had. In death, as in life, she was a fighter. And that fight would eventually become her voice from beyond the grave. The funeral for Carla Jan Walker was held on a gray February day, the kind of day that seemed to match the mood of an entire community in mourning. Western Hills High School sent representatives, and the church was filled to capacity with friends, family, and strangers who had been moved by this senseless tragedy. Rodney McCoy sat in the front rows, his head still bandaged, his eyes hollow with a guilt that would follow him for decades. He had survived when she hadn't. He had been unconscious while she was taken. The logical part of his brain knew that there was nothing he could have done. He had been attacked by surprise, overwhelmed in seconds. But logic has never been a match for grief's cruel whispers. Dawn and Fran Walker stood beside their daughter's casket with the kind of strength that only parents understand. The strength that comes not from acceptance, but from necessity. There were still 2 other children to raise. There was still a life to live, even if living it now felt impossible. But beneath that strength, there was something else. A resolve that would define the next 46 years of their existence. They would not let their daughter's murder go unsolved. They would not let her killer walk free forever. No matter how long it took, no matter what it cost them, they would find justice for Carla. The investigation in those early days was intensive. Fort Worth Police Detective J.D. Bennett was assigned to the case, and he attacked it with the kind of determination that gives cold case families hope. Evidence was collected from the crime scene, biological evidence that, in 1974, could tell investigators very little but would eventually become the key to everything. There were suspects almost immediately. A case this high-profile always attracts attention, and various names surfaced in the weeks following Carla's murder. Tips came in from across the region. Men with histories of violence against women were questioned. Polygraph tests were administered, but none of it led anywhere. The technology simply didn't exist to connect the physical evidence to a specific perpetrator. DNA analysis was still a decade away from being developed, and even further from being admissible in court. The biological evidence collected from Carla's body was preserved, a decision that would prove crucial decades later. But in 1974, it was essentially worthless from an investigative standpoint. The case went cold, not because of lack of effort, but because of lack of capability. The killer had left his signature, but no one could read it yet. For the Walker family, the years that followed were an exercise in sustained grief. Every anniversary of Carla's death was a fresh wound. Every graduation she missed, every wedding she should have attended, every grandchild she never got to meet. All of it was a reminder of what had been stolen. Fran Walker became an advocate for victims' rights, channeling her anguish into action. She spoke at conferences. She lobbied legislators. She kept Carla's memory alive in the public consciousness, even as the media moved on to newer tragedies, fresher horrors. Don Walker never stopped believing that his daughter's killer would be caught. He stayed in contact with the Fort Worth Police Department, checking in regularly, asking about new developments, reminding them that Carla still mattered. Even as detectives retired and new ones took their place, Don Walker was there, a constant presence, a living reminder that this case was not closed. Rodney McCoy carried his own burden. He married eventually, raised a family, built a life. But he never forgot that February night. He never stopped wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some way he could have protected the girl he loved. The survivor's guilt never fully healed. How could it? The 1980s came and went. So did the 1990s. A new millennium arrived, and still Carla Walker's case remained unsolved. Other cold cases from that era were cleared through DNA technology, which had matured into a powerful investigative tool. But for reasons that frustrated the Walker family, Carla's case seemed stuck. A new generation of investigative technology had emerged, genetic genealogy. This technique, pioneered in the Golden State Killer case, used DNA evidence not to find an exact match, but to find relatives. By uploading a DNA profile to public genealogy databases, investigators could identify family members of an unknown suspect and then use traditional genealogy research to build family trees, narrowing down the potential suspects to a manageable number. The Fort Worth Police Department's cold case unit had been tracking these developments closely. They knew that Carla Walker's case might be a candidate for this new approach. The biological evidence had been preserved for 45 years, waiting for a technology that finally existed. In early 2020, they made the decision to try. The process of genetic genealogy is both remarkably simple and incredibly complex. At its core, it relies on a fundamental truth of biology. We share DNA with our relatives. The closer the relative, the more DNA we share. Parents and children share 50%. Siblings share roughly 50%. First cousins share around 12.5%. The percentages decrease as the relationship becomes more distant, but even fourth or fifth cousins share enough DNA to be identifiable. When investigators uploaded the DNA profile from Carla Walker's case to a public genealogy database, they weren't looking for her killer directly. They were looking for anyone related to him. The results came back with several matches. People who shared small but significant percentages of DNA with the unknown suspect. These weren't close relatives. These were distant cousins, people who probably had no idea they were connected to a 46-year-old murder case. But for genetic genealogists, distant cousins are enough. The work that followed was painstaking. Investigators and genealogy experts began building family trees, tracing lineages back through generations, looking for points of intersection. If person A and person B both matched the unknown DNA profile, and if their family trees intersected at a common ancestor, then the suspect must be descended from that ancestor too. It's like working a puzzle where you have some of the edge pieces and a few fragments from the middle, and you have to figure out what the complete picture looks like. Weeks passed. Family trees grew into sprawling documents with hundreds of names. Branches were explored and eliminated. Dead ends were reached and new paths were discovered. And then, finally, the trees converged. There was a man. His name was Glen Samuel McCurley. He was 77 years old in 2020, living in Fort Worth, the same city where Carla Walker had been murdered. In 1974, he would have been 31 years old. He had worked in the area. He had access to the locations involved in the crime. He had never been on the radar of the original investigation. But investigators needed more than a family tree to make an arrest. They needed direct DNA evidence linking McCurley to the crime. The genealogical evidence was compelling, but it was circumstantial. They needed to confirm that the DNA found on Carla's body belonged specifically to Glen McCurley, not to some other member of his extended family. This is where investigative work becomes almost theatrical in its precision. Undercover officers were assigned to follow McCurley, waiting for an opportunity to collect his DNA without his knowledge. This is a legally accepted practice. Once someone discards an item, they lose their expectation of privacy over it. A coffee cup left at a restaurant, a napkin thrown in a trash can, a water bottle tossed aside. All of these can be collected and tested. The officers watched. They waited. And then, the moment came. McCurley discarded an item. The officers collected it. The item was rushed to a laboratory for analysis. The results were conclusive. The DNA found on Carla Walker's body in 1974 matched Glen Samuel McCurley. The odds of a coincidental match were astronomical, 1 in billions. There was no doubt. After 46 years, they had found her killer. But I want to pause here, right in the middle of this story, because I want you to think about something. For 46 years, Glen McCurley lived a normal life. He got up in the morning, went to work, came home, ate dinner, watched television, slept in a comfortable bed. He celebrated holidays. He attended family gatherings. He grew old. And for those same 46 years, Carla Walker lay in a grave. Her parents grew old waiting for justice. Rodney McCoy carried the weight of that night, and a community wondered if the monster among them would ever be caught. I want to ask you something, and I really want you to think about your answer. Leave it in the comments below. What do you think kept Glen McCurley from confessing? Was it the belief that he would never be caught? Was it the ability of evil people to compartmentalize their actions, to live as if the worst thing they ever did simply didn't happen? Or was it something else, some fundamental brokenness in the human soul that allows monsters to walk among us wearing ordinary faces? Think about that. Let me know what you believe. Now let me tell you about the arrest. September 21st, 2020. It was a Monday morning, and Glen McCurley probably thought it would be a day like any other. He was 77 years old, decades removed from the night he had destroyed a family and stolen a future. He had every reason to believe that he had gotten away with it. He was wrong. Fort Worth police officers arrived at his residence with an arrest warrant. When they informed him of the charges, capital murder in the death of Carla Jan Walker, McCurley didn't protest. He didn't claim innocence. He didn't express confusion about why they were there. He knew. He had always known. The news spread rapidly through Fort Worth and beyond. Social media lit up with the story. People who remembered the original case from 1974 expressed shock and satisfaction in equal measure. Younger people who had never heard of Carla Walker learned her name for the first time. And in the homes of the people who had loved her, there were tears. Tears of grief, yes, but also tears of something else, something that had been missing for 46 years. Vindication. The arrest of Glen Samuel McCurley was a beginning, not an ending. The justice system would now take over, and the Walker family would have to endure the agonizing process of a criminal trial. They would have to sit in the same room as the man who had murdered their daughter. They would have to listen to details about her final hours that no family should ever have to hear. But first, there were questions to answer. Who was Glen McCurley? How had he evaded detection for so long? And most importantly, was Carla his only victim? Investigators began digging into McCurley's past with renewed intensity. What they found was disturbing, but not surprising. McCurley had a history. He wasn't a random predator who had emerged from nowhere to commit one terrible act. He was a practiced hunter who had simply never been caught. In 1974, McCurley was working at a Bell helicopter plant in Fort Worth. He was married with children, outwardly respectable, the kind of man who wouldn't attract suspicion. But beneath that facade was something else entirely. Interviews with people who had known him revealed a pattern of concerning behavior. There were rumors of inappropriate attention toward young women. There were whispered stories that had never been reported to police. The kind of stories that might have raised red flags if anyone had known to connect them. But in 1974, there was no database linking predatory behavior across different contexts. There was no social media where victims could compare notes and recognize patterns. Each incident existed in isolation, and McCurley slipped through the cracks that existed between them. The investigation also revealed that McCurley might not have been unknown to the original detectives. His name had actually surfaced in the initial investigation, not as a prime suspect, but as one of many names that were checked and cleared. He had apparently passed whatever scrutiny he was subjected to at the time. This is a haunting reality of cold cases. Sometimes the killer was right there all along, hiding in plain sight, overlooked for reasons that seem obvious only in hindsight. For the Walker family, this revelation was bittersweet. On one hand, it was confirmation that the original investigators had done their jobs, had cast their net wide enough to include McCurley. On the other hand, It was a painful reminder of how close they had come to justice in 1974 and how far away it had ultimately remained. Don Walker had passed away in 2000, never knowing that his daughter's killer would eventually be caught. Fran Walker was still alive, now in her 90s, finally able to see the justice she had fought for. Rodney McCoy, the boyfriend who had never stopped carrying that February night with him, learned that the man who had attacked him had finally been identified. The question of additional victims remained open. Investigators examined unsolved cases from the 1970s, looking for similar patterns, similar victims, similar methods. They reached out to other law enforcement agencies, sharing what they had learned about McCurley's habits and history. As of this telling, no other cases have been definitively linked to McCurley. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. It simply means that the connections, if any, haven't been proven yet. Cold case investigators know that serial predators rarely stop on their own. They usually continue until they are caught, or until they become physically incapable. The 46 years between Carla Walker's murder and McCurley's arrest represent a vast span of opportunity. The families of other unsolved cases from that era now have a new name to consider, a new possibility to explore. Perhaps, in time, more families will find closure because of the break in Carla Walker's case. The pretrial proceedings began in late 2020, complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic that was reshaping every aspect of American life. Court dates were postponed. Procedures were adjusted. The wheels of justice, never fast under the best of circumstances, ground even more slowly. For McCurley's defense team, the case presented unique challenges. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. There was essentially no way to argue that someone else had committed the crime. The genetic genealogy had traced a direct line from the biological evidence to their client, and the subsequent confirmation test had eliminated any possibility of error. Their strategy, it would emerge, would not be denial. It would be something else entirely. Meanwhile, the Walker family prepared for what they knew would be a grueling process. They met with prosecutors. They reviewed evidence. They braced themselves for the moment when they would finally come face to face with the man who had haunted their lives for nearly 5 decades. Fran Walker, despite her advanced age, remained a pillar of strength. She had waited longer than most people wait for anything in their lives. She had watched her husband die without seeing justice. She had endured anniversary after anniversary, each one a reminder of what had been taken. But she had never given up. The power of that persistence cannot be overstated. Cold cases are solved for many reasons: new technology, new witnesses, lucky breaks. But one common thread runs through almost all of them. Someone refused to let the victim be forgotten. Someone kept making calls, kept attending meetings, kept pushing. For Carla Walker, that someone was her family. And now, finally, their persistence was about to pay off in a courtroom. The legal proceedings against Glen Samuel McCurley moved forward through 2021, each step bringing the Walker family closer to a conclusion they had waited 47 years to reach. But as anyone who has been through the criminal justice system knows, the path from arrest to resolution is rarely straight or simple. McCurley was initially charged with capital murder, a charge that carries the possibility of the death penalty in Texas. Given his age, he was 77 at the time of his arrest, and the complexity of death penalty cases, this raised questions about what kind of trial the Walker family could expect. Death penalty trials are notoriously lengthy, involving separate guilt and punishment phases, extensive jury selection, and multiple automatic appeals. For a family that had already waited nearly half a century, the prospect of additional years of legal proceedings was daunting. The prosecution faced other considerations as well. The key witnesses from 1974 had aged significantly or passed away. Rodney McCoy was still alive and willing to testify about the attack that had left him unconscious, but his memories of that night were filtered through decades of time and trauma. Physical evidence beyond the DNA was limited. Crime scene photos from 47 years ago, reports written by detectives who had long since retired or died. The DNA evidence was powerful, but it proved only that McCurley had been in contact with Carla Walker. The prosecution would need to build a case that proved not just contact, but kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. This is where the confession changed everything. During the investigation and subsequent interviews, McCurley had made statements to law enforcement. The details of these statements were not immediately made public, but their existence was significant. A defendant who admits to elements of the crime provides prosecutors with leverage and families with answers. The question of a confession in the Walker case became central to the proceedings that followed. What exactly had McCurley told investigators? Had he described what happened during the 2 days Carla was held captive? Had he shown remorse? Had he provided information that only the killer could know? These details would eventually emerge, painting a horrifying picture of premeditation and cruelty. McCurley, according to statements he made, had spotted Carla and Rodney in the parking lot near the country club. He had been driving in the area and had seen the young couple in their car. Something about the scene triggered whatever dark impulse lived inside him, and he made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. He attacked Rodney first, striking him repeatedly until he was unconscious. Then he dragged Carla from the car and forced her into his own vehicle. She was screaming, fighting, doing everything she could to escape. But McCurley was larger, stronger, and utterly without mercy. What followed over the next 2 days was a nightmare that I will not describe in detail, because some horrors should not be given voice. What I will say is this: Carla Walker fought until the very end. She never stopped resisting. She never gave up hope that she might escape, might survive, might see her family again. In the end, McCurley strangled her to make her stop struggling. He dumped her body in the culvert where she would be found 3 days later. These revelations, shared during the legal proceedings, gave the Walker family something they had been missing for 47 years: answers. Terrible answers, yes. Answers that would haunt their dreams. But answers nonetheless. For many families of murder victims, not knowing is the worst part. The imagination fills in the gaps with endless possibilities, each one more horrible than the last. Having the truth, even a truth this painful, provides a kind of closure that uncertainty never can. The question now became, what would McCurley's fate be? Given the overwhelming evidence, a trial on the question of guilt was essentially meaningless. Everyone knew McCurley had committed the crime. His own statements confirmed it. The only real question was what punishment he would receive. In April 2021, Glen Samuel McCurley pleaded guilty to the murder of Carla Jan Walker. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no jury deliberation, no lengthy appeals process. It also meant that McCurley's fate would be decided by a judge rather than by 12 citizens of Fort Worth. The Walker family was present for the plea. Fran Walker, now 92 years old, sat in the courtroom and watched the man who had murdered her daughter finally admit what he had done. Rodney McCoy was there too, still carrying the scars, physical and emotional, from that February night in 1974. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled a sentencing hearing. McCurley's defense team argued for leniency, citing his age and the fact that he had pleaded guilty, saving the family the trauma of a full trial. Prosecutors pushed for the maximum sentence, arguing that the brutality of the crime and the 47 years of evasion justified the harshest possible punishment. In the end, the judge found a middle ground, or what passed for one. Glen Samuel McCurley was sentenced to life in prison. At 78 years old, life in prison meant exactly that. McCurley would die behind bars, never again walking free, never again enjoying the mundane pleasures of ordinary life. He would spend whatever years remained to him in a cell, surrounded by concrete and steel, stripped of the freedom he had enjoyed for 47 years while Carla Walker's family suffered. Was it enough? Could any sentence ever be enough for what he had taken? The aftermath of McCurley's conviction rippled outward in ways both expected and surprising. For the Walker family, there was finally a sense of completion, not happiness, exactly, but something like peace. The wound would never fully heal, but at least now it could begin to close. Fran Walker gave a statement after the sentencing, her voice steady despite the emotions that must have been churning beneath the surface. She spoke of her daughter's memory, of the decades spent waiting for this day, of the gratitude she felt toward the investigators who had never given up. She spoke of her husband Don, who had died believing that justice would eventually come, even though he wouldn't live to see it. And she spoke of Carla. Not Carla the victim, but Carla the person. The teenager who loved to dance. The drill team member who practiced her routines until she had them perfect. The daughter who called her mother every day. The young woman with her whole life ahead of her. This is what murder steals. Not just a life, but a future. All the possibilities that Carla Walker would never explore. The career she might have had. The family she might have raised. The grandchildren who would never exist. The contributions she might have made to a world that lost her too soon. Rodney McCoy also found a measure of closure. For 47 years, he had carried the weight of that night, the unconsciousness that had left him helpless, the guilt that whispered he should have done something, somehow, even though logic said otherwise. Seeing McCurley sentenced, knowing that the man who had attacked him was finally being held accountable, helped to lift some of that weight. But the impact of the Walker case extended beyond the immediate family. It became a symbol of what modern investigative techniques could achieve, a beacon of hope for other families whose cases remained unsolved. Genetic genealogy, the technology that had cracked the case, was still relatively new. The Golden State Killer case had brought it into the public consciousness only 2 years earlier. The Walker case demonstrated that this wasn't a one-time success, that cold cases across the country could potentially be solved using the same methods. Law enforcement agencies around the nation took notice. Cold case units that had been skeptical of genetic genealogy began to reconsider. Prosecutors who had written off decades-old cases as unsolvable started pulling evidence from storage and submitting it for new testing. The Walker case also sparked important conversations about the ethics and implications of genetic genealogy. When investigators use public DNA databases to find distant relatives of suspects, they are essentially using innocent people's genetic information to catch criminals. This raises questions about privacy, consent, and the appropriate limits of law enforcement access to personal data. These questions don't have easy answers. The same technology that brought justice to Carla Walker could theoretically be misused in ways that harm innocent people. The balance between public safety and individual privacy is constantly being renegotiated, and genetic genealogy is one of the newest battlegrounds in that ongoing debate. For the Walker family, though, these abstract debates were secondary to a simple truth: the technology worked. It found their daughter's killer when nothing else could. Whatever its drawbacks or complications, genetic genealogy had given them something they had spent 47 years seeking. The case also renewed attention on other unsolved murders from the 1970s. Families of other victims reached out, hoping that the same techniques might work for their loved ones. Cold case investigators began systematically reviewing old files, looking for cases where biological evidence had been preserved and where genetic genealogy might provide leads. Some of these cases have since been solved. Others remain open. The work continues. And in Fort Worth, the memory of Carla Walker was honored in ways both formal and informal. The community that had mourned her in 1974 now celebrated the resolution of her case. Local media covered the conviction extensively. People who had known Carla, who had grown up with her, who had never forgotten her, finally had a conclusion to share. But perhaps the most meaningful tributes came from strangers, people who had never met Carla Walker but who had been moved by her story. Comments poured in on news articles and social media posts. People expressed their relief, their satisfaction, their hope that other families might find similar justice. This is the power of storytelling. When we share these stories, we keep the victims alive in a way that transcends death. Carla Walker is more than a cold case statistic. She is a real person whose life mattered, whose death mattered, whose memory continues to matter. And that matters. In the months and years following McCurley's conviction, the world continued to turn. The pandemic that had delayed his trial eventually receded. New cases made headlines and then faded from public attention. The news cycle, relentless as always, moved on to the next tragedy, the next outrage, the next story demanding our attention. But for those closest to the Walker case, the echoes continued to resonate. Fran Walker lived long enough to see justice served, a blessing that many cold case families never receive. She passed away knowing that her daughter's killer had been caught, knowing that the fight she had waged for nearly 5 decades had not been in vain. Her legacy lives on in the victims' rights advocacy she championed, in the laws she helped to change, in the families she inspired to keep fighting. Rodney McCoy has spoken publicly about his experience, sharing the burden he carried and the relief he felt when it was finally lifted. His story is a reminder that violent crime creates ripples of trauma that extend far beyond the immediate victim. The survivors carry their own wounds, and their healing deserves attention and support. The investigators who solved the case, the detectives, the genealogists, the lab technicians, went on to apply their skills to other unsolved mysteries. Each case they work on represents another family waiting for answers, another victim whose story deserves to be told. The Walker case proved that their work matters, that persistence and technology together can achieve what once seemed impossible. And what of Glen McCurley himself? As of this recording, McCurley remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his days. His appeals have been exhausted. His freedom is gone. Whatever remains of his life will be lived in the shadow of the bars he so long avoided. There is no redemption arc for Glen McCurley in this story. He showed no genuine remorse for what he did. His guilty plea was not an act of conscience, but a calculated legal strategy. Even in his statements to police, he attempted to minimize his culpability, to shift blame, to portray himself as something other than the monster he was. Some people are simply evil. This is a hard truth that we often resist, preferring to believe that everyone is capable of change, that no one is beyond redemption. And perhaps, in some abstract theological sense, that's true. But in the practical world we inhabit, there are those who choose darkness so completely that light can never reach them. Glen McCurley chose darkness. He chose it in 1974 when he attacked 2 young people who had done nothing to him. He chose it during the 2 days he held Carla Walker captive. He chose it when he strangled the life out of her. And he chose it every single day for the next 47 years, when he lived his comfortable life knowing what he had done. He does not deserve our sympathy. He does not deserve our attempts to understand. He deserves only what he has finally received, a cell, a number, and the knowledge that his secret is finally known. But Carla Walker deserves so much more. She deserves to be remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived. The drill team practices that ran late into the evening. The laughter that filled her family's home. The Valentine's weekend that was supposed to be the beginning of so many happy memories. She deserves to be remembered for the way she fought back against the man who attacked her, for the evidence she left behind. Evidence that she had no way of knowing would one day catch her killer, but that spoke across the decades nonetheless. She deserves to be remembered as a person, not a case number. As a daughter, not a victim. As a young woman whose potential was stolen, but whose memory endures. And she deserves to be remembered by us, by everyone who hears her story, who carries it forward, who refuses to let her become just another forgotten name in the long catalog of American violence. This is how victims achieve a kind of immortality, not through monuments or memorials, though those have their place, but through the simple act of remembrance, through stories told and retold, passed down through generations, keeping the flame of memory alive even when those who knew the victim personally have passed on. Carla Walker's story is now part of that eternal flame. I want to end this story where we began, with that February night in 1974, with a teenage girl whose life was about to change forever. But I want you to see it differently now. When Carla Walker got into Rodney McCoy's car that evening, she had no idea what was coming. None of us ever do. Life is a series of moments strung together, each one filled with possibility, each one potentially the last. We take our safety for granted because the alternative, living in constant awareness of our own vulnerability, would be unbearable. Carla deserved safety. She deserved to spend that evening with her boyfriend, to go home at the end of the night, to wake up the next morning and continue her life. She deserved graduation and college and career and love and children and grandchildren and old age and all the ordinary miracles that most of us take for granted. She was robbed of all of it by a man who saw her not as a person, but as prey. But here is what Glen McCurley could never steal, no matter how hard he tried. He could not steal her spirit. He could not steal the love her family had for her. He could not steal the impact she had on everyone who knew her. He could not steal the evidence her body preserved, waiting patiently for the day when technology would catch up with justice. And he could not steal her victory, because Carla Walker won. It took 46 years, but she won. Her killer is in prison. Her name is known. Her story has been told to millions of people around the world. The family who loved her lived to see justice served. The boyfriend who survived that night has found a measure of peace. The investigators who worked her case can point to her as proof that their work matters. Every cold case that is solved because of the techniques pioneered in cases like hers is another victory for Carla Walker. Every family that finds closure because genetic genealogy provided the break they needed owes a debt to the Walker family's persistence. Every investigator who refuses to give up on a decades-old case is following in the footsteps of those who never gave up on Carla. This is her legacy, not the violence that took her life, but the justice that followed. Not the evil that one man chose, but the good that many people chose in response. Carla Walker's voice was silenced on that February night in 1974. But across the decades, a new voice emerged, the voice of her DNA, speaking a truth that could not be ignored, identifying her killer with absolute certainty. The dead can speak, not in the way we might imagine, not in whispered ghost stories or supernatural communications, but in the evidence they leave behind, in the memories they impart to those who love them, in the stories that are told in their names. Carla Walker spoke, and the world finally listened. For 46 years, her killer walked free, believing he had gotten away with murder. For 46 years, her family waited, believing that justice would eventually come. For 46 years, her case sat in the files of the Fort Worth Police Department, waiting for the technology that would finally crack it open. And then, in 2020, a phone call was made. An arrest warrant was signed. A monster was finally caged. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, justice is simply patient, waiting for the right moment, the right tools, the right people to bring it to fruition. Carla Walker's justice was delayed for nearly half a century. But it came. It came with the force of 46 years of accumulated grief, transformed into 46 years of vindication. It came with the certainty of modern science, bridging the gap between a 1974 crime scene and a 2020 courtroom. It came with the power of a family's love, refusing to let their daughter be forgotten. And it came with a message for every other family still waiting, still hoping, still fighting. Don't give up. Because if justice could find Carla Walker after 46 years, it can find your loved one too. This is the end of Carla Walker's story. But in another sense, it is just the beginning. Because every time someone shares her story, every time someone speaks her name, every time someone learns about her case and carries that knowledge forward, she lives again. She was 17 years old when she died. She would have been 63 in 2020. She never got to experience any of the decades in between. But because of the people who refused to let her go, because of the technology that finally caught up with her killer, because of stories like this one, she will never truly be forgotten. Carla Jan Walker, 1957 to 1974, daughter, friend, fighter, victor. May she rest in the peace she earned through a fight that lasted 46 years beyond her death. And may her story remind us all that evil does not win in the end. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it takes new technologies we haven't even imagined yet. Sometimes it takes a level of persistence that would break most people. But in the end, the truth comes out. In the end, the killers are caught. In the end, the victims are heard. In the end, Carla Walker won. And now, if her story has moved you, if her victory has inspired you, I ask one final thing. Share this video. Tell her story to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like hers. And remember her name, Carla Jan Walker. Say it out loud if you can. Let her name exist in the air one more time, carried by your voice, made real by your memory. She deserves at least that much. We all do.